Hi, welcome to our new lecture. Hoping you're doing great and you already started to prepare for your final and you reviewed the previous lectures. I'm so happy to join you in this semester, actually, in spite of all the conditions and circumstances. The only thing that I'm asking you to do is to listen to the lectures very carefully because I'm afraid that reading the slides alone is not enough to cover everything that we need to talk about, or is not giving you the entire explanation for whatever you are finding in these slides. So the slides are only brief points for whatever we are discussing and talking about. So please make sure to read and listen to the lectures as well, because this is the only way you might guarantee that you do understand everything out of the lectures. If you still remember in lecture 17, we started to talk about constitution, the role of the law, how it is very important that we do understand the role of the law as a protective tool for human rights and dignity. Then we discussed the idea of constitution and why we do see constitution as a tool. Again, we talked about the way that these constitutions could be changed, or the methodology of changing or modifying the constitution. In this lecture, we're going to proceed talking about the elements of democratic communities. Beside the law and the constitution, we are going to talk about several extra points or elements. So let's start. Uh, in this part, we're going to discuss the idea of federalism. And I need you to see federalism as a new tool, a new way to discuss the existence of communities and governments. And federalism, we're going to talk about federal of power. When free people choose to live under an agreed constitutional framework, it may be implemented in various ways, actually, or in various patterns. Some democratic communities or some democracies have unitary administrations. Another solution is a federal system of government power shared at the local, regional, and national levels. The United States, for example, is a federal republic with the states that have their own legal standing and authority independent of the federal government. Unlike the political subdivisions in nations such as British or French, for example, which have a unitary and political structure, American states cannot be abolished or changed by the federal government. Although power at the national level in the United States has grown significantly, states still possess significant responsibilities in fields such education, health, transportation, and law enforcement. In turn, individual U.S. states have generally followed the federal model by delegating many functions, such as operation of schools, police, to local communities. The idea of the federal system or federalism is to create many central centers. It is like a delegation. It is deriving authorities from the main major authority. The divisions of power and authority in a federal system are never neat and tidy. Federal states and local agencies can all have overlapping and even conflicting agendas in areas such, for example, as education or criminal justice. But federalism can maximize opportunities for the citizens' involvement so vital to the functioning of democratic society. Americans believe their federal structure protects their individual autonomy. It is very important to see the idea of federalism as a way to delegate authorities, a way to divide the privilege for certain states. Uh, Someone could ask me, is it a system that could work for any community? Actually, it is not. Maybe it works for the United States because, as you know, the United States is like 50 states, and it is a very large place in the term of geographic area. Uh, and the distance and the identity of each state really differ from state to another. This exact reasons, the reason, like we might have three core reasons: the geographic, the number of the states, the shape and the identity of these states make it more easier to have this federal system. But for example, for a country, for example, like Egypt, it is definitely not easy to have the federal system because the community itself is different. There is general identity that unified all the Egyptians, uh, uh, which also the Egyptian people get used to this very centralized system, while in United States, each state is a different separated units. Even if they are following the same constitution, each state has its own strategies, its own paths, its own identity. One of the most important differences that could reflect this, after COVID-19 and during the quarantine, some of the states were totally in locking down while others are not. And this is clarify exactly what is the identity behind federalism. It is um, it does mean that they are under the same constitution, but the implementation and the techniques, the mechanism of implementing the constitution enable these states to create their own identity in a way or another. The other important point that we're going to talk about, beside the idea of federalism, is the three pillars of government. As has been noted, through free elections, citizens of a democracy confer powers that are defined by law upon their leaders. In a constitutional democracy, the power of government is divided so that the legislative authority makes the laws, the executive authority carries them out, and the judiciary operates quasi-independency track. These divisions are sometimes described as a separation of powers. In actual practice, however, such a division are rarely neat, and in most modern democratic states, these powers are overlapping and shared as much as they are separated. Legislatures may attempt to manage programs through detailed regulations. Executive offices routinely engage in detailed rulemaking. Both legislators, executive officers conduct judicial style hearings on a wide range of issues. Since we start to talk about democracies, democratic communities, we talked in a very clear way, or we hinted in a very clear way on the importance of the separation between powers. And definitely, if we're going to talk about the elements of the modern democratic communities, it is very important to point again to the realistic face of the separation between power. Actually, you could never ever find a space or a state or any country that have this clear separation of powers. Most of the countries witness very weird overlapping between the three authorities in a way, and the role of the authorities itself is not clear. Even through the constitution or their constitutions, it is not clear that to which limits, for example, the executive authority is allowed to interfere in the, for example, judgment or the judiciary authority, and vice versa. Let's start to talk about number one, executive authority. In constitutional democracies, executive authority is generally limited in three ways: by separation of powers just noted among the national governments, executive, legislative, and judicial branches, with the legislative track and judiciary able to check the power of the executive branch; by the constitutional guarantees of fundamental rights; and by periodic elections. So, how we do guarantee uh, to keep the hands of executive authority away of the court, away of the parliament, for example, by two main ways. Number one, by make it very clear that the parliament, the court, are having very clear privileges and authorities, and to make it very clear that the Constitution can guarantee the fundamental rights. And again, the importance of have periodic elections to protect and to remind these um, uh, people who are working inside the executive authority that they are just employees. Uh, for authoritarians and other critics, a common conceptual and ambiguous for the track of democracies um, is lacking the power to oppress, also lack the authority to govern. This view is fundamentally wrong. Democracies require that their governments be limited, not that they be weak. It is not necessary if I limit the power of the executive authority to make it weak. I need to make it strong, but strong to protect the sovereignty of the government and the country, not strong to attack the citizens. I need to make the executive authority strong enough to implement the constitution, to implement the rules, the norms by the legislative and judicial authorities, not to attack them. Executive authority in modern democracies is generally organized in one of two ways: as a parliamentary or presidential system. Uh, these two ways were established or were designed to make the executive authority strong enough to protect the country, to guarantee developmental track, and in the same time mm, uh, to make the executive authority incapable to hurt or to touch the basic fundamental rights of human beings. In a parliamentary system, the majority party or a coalition of parties willing to govern together is the legislative track. The legislature forms the executive branch of the government, headed by a prime minister. The legislative and executive branches are not entirely distinct from one another in a parliamentary system, since the prime minister and members of the cabinet are drawn from the parliament. Even so, the prime minister is the national leader. One of the most important elements about the parliamentary system is this integration roles between how we're going to elect the parliament and how the parliament will elect a prime minister. The role of the prime minister and the role of the parliament itself, it's a little bit confusing and ambiguous because the parliamentary system depends on that people will elect a parliament, and as a result of this process, or as a result of the elections, we're going to have a prime minister who's going to be the head of the executive authority itself. So some authors, some thinkers are accusing the system that this is totally lacking of separation between powers, and because the methodology behind this election, that this prime minister must represent the majority of the political party who is going to win the election for the parliamentary elections. So it is a little bit ambiguous how we're talking about the separation between powers, especially the executive, um, parliamentary, constitutional track, and the prime minister itself is derived from the parliament. How we are talking about the separation between executive, legislative, and judicial authority, once the executive authority itself is derived from the parliament, which is in a way or another is the legislative authority. While if we're gonna have a look for the presidential track or the presidential system, we're gonna see something different. In a presidential system, by contrast, the president usually is elected separately from the members of the legislative authority. Both of the president and the legislative authority have their own power bases and political constitutions and tracks which serve to check and balance each other. Um, if the prime minister is derived from the parliament, the president must be elected directly from people, from citizens. And in this system, we do have two separate elections. One election to elect the president directly by people, and the other is to elect the parliament. People will go for two options. Either they will select a president that reflects the majority of the political parties, or at certain points, the president will not be from the same party or the same political party who gained the majority in the parliament. Um, this dilemma between the president and the parliament could end by an early election if there is no kind of coalition and understanding between the president and the parliament. But the important point here is there is no overlapping in the election. These are two separated processes. People will elect directly the president, who will have the authority of the executive branch, while parliament will have the authorities of the legislative branch as well. Let's compare between the two systems and see whether these are good, bad, in which distance they can be sufficient, etc. Each system has its own institutional strengths and weaknesses, actually. A principal claim for parliamentary system, which today make up the majority of democracies, is their responsiveness and flexibility. Parliamentary governments, especially if elected through proportional representation, tend towards multi-party system, where even relatively small political groups or parties are represented in the legislative track. As a result, distinct minorities can still participate in the political process and political life and the political government at the highest level of government. Should the governing coalition collapse or the strongest party lose its mandate, the prime minister resigns and a new government forms and new elections take place, all usually within a relatively short time. The majority or the major drawback to parliaments is the dark side of flexibility and power sharing and stability. Multi-party coalitions may be fragile and collapse at the first sign of political crisis, resulting in governments that are in office for relatively short periods of time and unable to address difficult political issues. On the other hand, other parliamentary systems are stable by strong majority parties. The problem with the minority and majority here is the weight of participation, the structure of the coalition itself. What we are trying to say in this part is that it is very important to see the advantage and the disadvantage of these systems. For example, the parliamentary system is very important because it is giving a space for each party, each political party, even these small parties, to be part of the decision-making wheel. But at the same time, this clustering, this multi-party system could be a reason why this government is weak or could weaken the government in certain crisis issues because each party will try to drive to attract the government for their interests and side. And by the end of the day, the government will be weak and definitely will be driven to a very early elections. But at certain point, it is not necessary. We can have parliamentary systems who are stable and could serve the country in a very good way. For presidential systems, the principal's claims are direct accountability, continuity, and strength. Presidents elected from fixed periods by the people can claim authority deriving from direct election, whatever the standing of their political party in the Congress. By creating separate, by theoretically equal branches of government, a presidential system seeks to establish strong executive and legislative institutions, each able to claim a mandate from the people and each capable of checking and balancing the other. The weakness of separately elected presidents and legislative authority is a potential stalemate. Presidents may not possess enough political leads in the legislative authority to cast the votes to enact the policies they want, but by employing their veto power, the right, for example, of the executive under certain circumstances to annual laws passed by the legislative authority. They can prevent the legislative authority from enacting its own legislative programs. The late political scientist Richard Newsted described presidential power in the United States, for example, as not the power to command, but the power to persuade. What he meant is that the United States president who wants Congress to enact a legislative program to his liking, or at least to avoid laws he disagrees with being passed by political opponents, must command political popularity with the public and be able to forge effective alliances in the Congress. Let's talk more about the legislative realm. Elected legislators, whether under a parliamentary or presidential system, are the principal form of deliberating, debating, and passing law in a representative democracy. They are so-called rubber stamp parliaments, merely approving the decisions of an authoritarian leader. Legislators may question government officials about their actions and decisions, approve national budgets, and confirm executive opinions, decisions to courts and ministries. In some democracies, legislative committees provide lawmakers a forum for these public examinations of national issues. Legislators may support the government in power, or they may serve as a loyal political opposition that offers alternative policies and programs. Legislators have a responsibility to articulate their views as effectively as possible, but they must work within the democratic ethic of tolerance, respect, and compromise to reach agreement that will benefit the general wealth of all people, of all citizens, not just their political supporters. Each legislator must alone decide on how to balance the general wealth and the general interest, the general welfare, with the needs of a local constitutional track and constitutionally. It is very important to see the 2 points of the aims of these legislative representatives. Lacking the separation of power characteristics of a presidential system, parliamentary system must rely much more heavily on the internal political dynamics of the parliament itself to provide checks and balance on the power of the government. These usually take the form of a single organized opposition party that shadows the government, or of competition among multiple opposition parties. The last important point we need to talk about is the independent judgery, the third authority. Independent and professional judges are the foundation of a fair, impartial, and constitutionally guaranteed system of courts of law. This independence doesn't imply judges can make decisions based on personal performance or preferences, definitely, but rather that they are free to make lawful decisions even if those decisions contradict the government or powerful parties involved in the case. In democracies, the protective constitutional structure and prestige of the judicial branch of government guarantees independence from political pressure. Judicial ruling can be impartial based on the facts of a case, legal arguments, and relevant laws without restrictions or impaired influence by the executive or legislative authorities. These principles ensure equal legal protection for everyone. The power of a judge to review public laws and declare them in violation of the nation's constitution serves as fundamental check on potential government abuse of power, even if the government is elected by popular majority. This power, however, requires that the courts be seen as fundamentally independent and non-partisan and able to reset their decisions upon the law, not political considerations. Whether elected or appointed, judges must have job security to ensure guaranteed by law in order that they can make decisions without concern of pressure or attack by those who are in certain positions or authorities. It is very important to protect judges to be able to protect the law and people. Thank you so much for joining me in this. Please be safe and read the slides. Be ready for your final and see you soon. Thanks.